Pennsylvania German Passenger List 1727 to 1808, a user's guide. So what we're going to take a look at today are, well, as the title says, Pennsylvania German Passenger Lists. These actually refer to a very specific set of records created by first the province and later state of Pennsylvania between the years 1727 to 1808. They created lists of all foreign settlers who landed at the port of Philadelphia. Pretty much all of these settlers were German or German speakers. And of course, since this is so long before the actual unification of Germany, German speaking and German are pretty much interchangeable terms. It may not be widely known, but colonial passenger lists are often about as rare as hen's teeth. So this extraordinary collection that we're going to go through today is the far and away the finest collection and example that we have of passenger records created during colonial America. So when I say Pennsylvania Germans, what am I really talking about? Well, to understand that, we have to understand the founding of the province of Pennsylvania and the unique nature of that province, how it came to be, and who was running it. In our case, this will start with the man they call the proprietor, one William Penn. William Penn is a British nobleman who, when he was a young man, converted to the then new denomination of Quakerism. He's a Quaker, or as they call themselves, the Religious Society of Friends. They're known for their commitment to peace, simplicity, equality, and integrity, and are famous for rejecting formal church structures and emphasize a personal and direct experience with God. They typically reject any kind of rituals and clergy, believing them to be largely unnecessary. In the 1600s, this was about as radical as you could get. So Quakers, pretty much from the very beginning of their existence, were targeted for persecution and even death. It's somewhat shocking that a man such as William Penn, who came from the nobility, would convert to Quakerism. But indeed he did, and he put his belief into practice. Despite being the son of a British admiral, he devoted himself to pacifism and attempted to find a way to help his fellow believers escape the persecutions of the day. Now, when he had first converted, Penn would actually tour the European continent, talking to people and often trying to convert some. He spent roughly about 6 years in Germany from 1671 to 1677, and this in turn would plant the seeds in his mind later on. Even though he was often in and out of jail, the fact that he was a nobleman gave him a lot of privileges that were not stripped of him despite his faith. And after his father died, King Charles II, it turns out, owed a very large debt to the Penn family, financially that is. Charles was often strapped for cash because he enjoyed a somewhat lavish lifestyle, so he didn't really have much in the way of money to give to the Penns, but what he did have was legal title to large amounts of land in what is today the United States. In particular, Pennsylvania. He ended up in 1681 signing over a gigantic amount of land, once again the legal title, not necessarily talking to the Native Americans or indigenous people who were living there at the time, to settle the debt. And when that happened, William Penn became the single largest private landholder in the world, at least on paper. He had claim to roughly 45,000 square miles. And he decided to take this land and turn it into a sanctuary, not just for Quakers, but for all people who believed in a monotheistic God were allowed to come and settle in Pennsylvania. Once again, a very radical thing to do, because unlike other groups that settled in the what would become the United States that had very specific ideas about how people who came there were to act and behave and believe, the Pennsylvania was about as open and liberal a society as you can imagine in the late 1600s. To make the colony a success, though, Penn needed settlers. So, of course, he had some from England as well as the rest of the British Isles, including Ireland. But the best way to make a colony a successful one was to have as many people as possible. That's when his mind turned to his years in Germany and decided to invite Germans to come and settle in Pennsylvania. The very first settlement in Pennsylvania that was settled by Germans was, unsurprisingly, Germantown in 1683. And this, at the time, while a separate city, would fairly quickly be swallowed up by larger Philadelphia, but it would act as an anchor for new immigrants coming in, and in fact help encourage more German immigrants to come, knowing that there was already an established community there. When we're talking numbers, we're looking at about 84,000 to roughly 130,000 Germans, we're not exactly sure, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is later, arrived between the years 1683 and 1775, mostly from southwestern Germany and Switzerland. Now, to immigrate across the ocean sea is an incredibly brave act. In some cases, one of desperation, but brave nonetheless. It's a lot to ask people to give up their home, everything they've ever known, to try to start over. And how terrifying must it have been? You're not just going a couple states over, you're literally going across the ocean to this new world that you have very little idea of, except from reading maybe some pamphlets, and if you're lucky, perhaps a conversation with someone who's been there. So why do so many people end up leaving their homes and coming? Well, basically, when we're looking at southwestern Germany in the late 1600s, early 1700s, things are really bad. You have a population explosion combined with multiple famines. Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, has largely devastated this part of Germany, sacking many villages and towns in his efforts to push French territory to the Rhine. Certain groups, as we'll see, suffered religious persecution. Everybody is under the thumb of very, very onerous taxes and also compulsory military service. And so those are all the push factors. But why Pennsylvania versus somewhere else is a bit of a different story. On the one hand, you have cheap and fertile land, religious toleration that we've already talked about, low taxes, and freedom from conscription or even militia service. Because William Penn will actually develop excellent relations with the Native Americans that are in Pennsylvania, they will agree to sell large amounts of territory to him. And he will also, despite being a pacifist, will allow them to purchase firearms from him. So you have a very unique situation in colonial America where most of the colonists are not armed, but the Native Americans are. But because of the unique relationship, Americans act almost as a shield against other hostile groups in the area that enable Pennsylvania to thrive without its own military. So when we're talking about the breakdown of religious denomination when these Germans are coming over, a lot of people tend to think that they're exclusively religious minorities like Mennonite or Amish, and that's not really the case. As you can see from this handy chart, the solid majority of these people will either be traditional Lutherans or German Reformed / Calvinist, which is one of the three recognized forms of Christianity in Germany at the time. So basically 2/3 will be Lutheran or Calvinist. And as you'll see noted on here, often the Lutherans and Calvinists will share a church, much as they would do in Germany later on, until there's enough Calvinists to split off. That being said, when you consider the relatively small numbers of groups like Mennonites, Amish, Moravians, etc., very large percentages of them will come to the New World where they can practice their faith in peace. So when I say southwestern Germany and Switzerland, we're largely talking about what is known as the Palatinate, which you can see is roughly in this shaded area here on the map. Now, I should note, they are not exclusively Palatines, despite the fact that many of them will be called Palatinates just because so many people are coming from there. It's just easier to call them all Palatines, even if they're Swiss or Hessians or what have you. You will not really see much in the way of Germans from other areas of Germany or Eastern Europe for a variety of reasons. But just because most of them will come from the Palatinate, they will not necessarily be Palatines. So the big reason why this is a really restricted base from which to draw these settlers is because of transportation issues, right? This is far before railroads and steamships and things like that. The most affordable way for these Germans to get to the New World is to sail down the Rhine River and then take a ship at Rotterdam. It's not that simple to just sail down the Rhine. This is the time when Germany is divided into hundreds of tiny little statelets, and many of which have some portion of their border along the River Rhine. And the issue there is that everybody has a castle or a chain or something along those lines that will stop boats and take a toll. To put it into perspective, there are over 27 tolls between Switzerland and the Dutch border in this time period. So think about that the next time you're on a toll road, maybe going to Chicago or someplace like that, and you pay the one toll. Just imagine having to do that another 26 times on your way to the same place. And you can get an idea of just how cripplingly expensive this can be. This also takes a couple weeks because not only does it take time to get down the river, depending on what sort of preconditions you've made before you get to Rotterdam, you may have to wait another few weeks for the ship to get there. And you have to eat, you have to have some place to stay, and all this can rapidly consume what little savings these immigrants have. Many of them will be guided by a guide that is known as a Newlander. And that's usually someone who's already made the journey to Philadelphia before and has some experience and has often been hired by these groups to help guide them along the way. Unfortunately, more than a few of these Newlanders were not particularly trustworthy and were noted for stealing money, leading people astray, things like that. And it will have an effect on migration from Germany to the Americas. As you probably saw on that previous map, the ships from Rotterdam, they actually have to make a stopover at a British port. This will usually be the Isle of Wight, the big city there, Cowes. And the reason for that is that this is an age of what's called mercantilism. And so basically what that means is the belief is that wealth is a finite source. So if you're trading some commodity and I'm not getting a part of it, I'm losing out. So it's actually British law, and eventually this will be a factor in the American Revolution. Only British ships can trade with British colonies. So these ships that are leaving from Rotterdam, they're not Dutch. They're British. There's obviously close coordination between Rotterdam merchants and British ship owners, but the ships have to be British. And even if the ships are British, they still have to make a stop at a British port before going to Pennsylvania. And all this adds time and expense to it. So let's say, you've left cows. Well, then you're kind of stuck in a relatively small ship for about 7 to 8 weeks. And that's, of course, if you're lucky. The wind is with you, no storms. The food turns out to be only slightly moldy. But all told, it's not a great experience. Although most people will get there and be in relatively decent shape. Now, I've talked a little bit about the expense because I think it's something that's very important, particularly for genealogists to note, because the voyage is so expensive. Going down the Rhine, staying in Rotterdam, taking the ship, all these sorts of things. A significant proportion of these immigrants will have to engage in indentured servitude to pay for their voyage. Now, this is not a majority of the German immigrants. I would say probably more than 2/3 could afford to do it without having to indenture themselves, but a significant portion of them will have to do so. And that's important, of course, because that's another record set that you can try and track down. All that being said, why do the lists exist? You will not see lists in Pennsylvania for British or Irish immigrants. And that's basically because, as far as the government of Great Britain is concerned, these are all just part of the First British Empire. They're not foreigners. It's like going from one state to another. But that's not the case with these Germans. The sheer amount of German immigration swiftly started to concern authorities and even everyday people. So I'm actually going to read a Benjamin Franklin quote from young Benjamin Franklin about how he felt about the German immigrants. And I quote, "I am perfectly of your mind that measures of great temper are necessary with the Germans, and am not without apprehensions that through their indiscretion or ours, or both, great disorders and inconveniences may one day arise among us. Those who come hither are generally of the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation, and as ignorance is often attended with credulity when knavery would mislead it, and with suspicion when honesty would set it right, and as few of the English understand the German language, and so cannot address them, in either from the press or pulpit, 'tis almost impossible to remove any prejudices they once entertain." Which is pretty harsh for these German immigrants. I should note eventually Benjamin Franklin will change his mind, but young Benjamin Franklin could be pretty spicy when it came to foreigners. So very quickly, the Quakers have already become a minority in their own colony. So, and frankly, not just the Quakers, but the English are really starting to worry that they're going to be overwhelmed by Germans and that the colony of Pennsylvania will basically be German. To put it in perspective, by 1750, nearly 40% of Pennsylvania was of German or German background. That's a huge percentage. So you can probably understand why people are starting to becoming, well, frankly, worried. So as such, the government decided to take action. They weren't going to ban foreigners the way some people would have preferred them to do, but instead they are going to make sure that the Germans understand exactly what they're signing up for. And that will lead to our 3 categories of lists that will be known as A lists, B lists, and C lists, right? And they all have to do with keeping track of the immigrants coming in and a sworn oath of their loyalty to the British state. In 1727, it was required that ship captains would keep a record of all foreigners arriving at Philadelphia. These A lists are also known as captains' lists, and that they're the first ones you'll come across, and those are the ones that, if you're really lucky, will feature the entire family, both women and children, and not just the adult males. Now, in addition, you are also required to swear an oath of loyalty and fidelity to the British Crown and the proprietor of Pennsylvania. These oaths of allegiance are known as the B lists. Finally, 2 years later, because things have started to heat up in Europe, and the British government is worried that the former British royal family, the Stuarts, may try to come back and be kings of England once again, and possibly even try to return them to the Catholic faith, they start making the Germans take an oath for swearing the authority of the Pope and the Stuarts. And these oaths of abjuration are known as C lists. After the Revolution, and before the United States federal government starts to have anything to do with naturalization, the oaths will be to the state of Pennsylvania, though you will see some that will be to the United States as well. Our lists end in 1808 because that is the point at which federal government over naturalization officially occurs, as well as the fact that due to all the wars in Europe, there really isn't much immigration in this time period to speak of. These lists have been published all over the place, but when we're talking about the definitive edition, we're looking at the 3-volume set by Ralph Beaver Strasburger. And on your handout, you can find links to all 3 of them. They have been digitized on Internet Archive, etc. Very straightforward. Volume 1 contains lists from 1727 to 1775. Volume 2 contains lists from 1776 to 1808, and quite usefully, the handwriting facsimiles. And then Volume 3 is the index. There will be later editions that omit the handwriting facsimiles and slim it down to just 2 volumes. But I've included the original 3 in the links because I think it's important to take a look at those signatures. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So Volume 1, far and away the biggest collection of actual lists. They start in 1683. You'll see waves, years where many ships will come, then you'll see years where none will come. Honestly, a big way to track it is to see what wars in Europe have broken out at what point. That can often answer some questions. So most of your ancestors you'll be looking for will probably be in Volume 1. The B and C lists, the oaths of allegiance and abjuration, only apply to men over the age of 15. You will not see women and children in B and C lists. Now, the captain's lists that are supposed to be required to list every foreigner, women and children included, they may list the women and children, but not always. I think one thing that you really do have to understand here is that these laws are followed pretty haphazardly. Frankly, given the lack of state control and efficiency at the time, it's a minor miracle that so many of these were done in the first place. I can tell you other provinces like Virginia. Virginia passed a law about 3 different times requiring foreigners to be registered at ports, and it doesn't seem like it was ever followed. When it comes to a lot of these colonial records, we'll take what we can get. But just understand that they are in no way, shape, or form complete. Now, Volume 2 consists of all the lists from 1776 until 1808, when the lists stop. Relatively little in the way of lists. The most important thing that you're going to find here is of the signatures on the B and C lists. As you can see, a nice example here from the ship Aurora, October 8th, 1744. So what's the importance of those signatures? So many of these names are the same. There's a reason I call it too many Johanns, because it seems like almost everybody is named Johann or Heinrich. And then you add in common surnames like Schaefer that can be spelled a billion different ways. You need something that can distinguish your immigrant ancestor from others. So having a handwriting sample can be an absolute godsend when it comes to determining which person is yours. Because you can compare signatures on so many things, you have a really awesome opportunity to confirm that your Johann is that Johann, and so on and so forth. So let's take a look at one example. So right here, you'll see highlighted the signature of one Caspar Schaefer, who arrived in Philadelphia on the ship Queen Elizabeth on September 16th, 1738. This is a B list, so this is him swearing his oath of allegiance to the British Crown and the proprietor of the province of Pennsylvania. Now, I suppose you could argue that Caspar here will actually go on to violate said oath because he will become a leading American patriot in Stillwater, Sussex County, New Jersey, and in fact will become successful enough that he will be elected to New Jersey's very first legislature as a state rather than a colony. Supposedly, whenever he would get really, really excited, he would start screaming in German, "Das ist nicht recht." So basically, that's not right, over and over and over again. So taking a look at that signature, I have here an example from his family Bible. You've got the Germanic Fraktur style above. But if you look down at the bottom here, you can see Caspar's actual signature. And when you can compare the two, you note that the handwriting is basically the same. There might be some bigger loops here, but this is my Caspar Schaefer. So that is why it's so important to take a look at those handwriting samples whenever you can, because they can pay untold dividends down the road, because so much of this is establishing which one is your ancestor. Then we move on to volume 3. Volume 3 is the index. Fairly straightforward, but one of the things that I really do like about this index that makes these Strasburger books the creme de la creme when it comes to these lists is not only will you find a particular name spelling, you will find that they have indexed it to other spellings. You can see here with like Hoffman, you've got 6 different spellings of Hoffman. You've got 3 different spellings of Hoff. And that's so important because in this time period, before language is standardized, when many people do not necessarily know how to spell or write, even though I should note the majority of these male immigrants will know enough at least to sign their name, this is also a time where things are not necessarily solidified when it comes to how you spell a particular name. So you have to get creative. Something we say literally every single day here at the center is that in genealogy, spelling is optional. So if you're not finding your ancestor, it would not be a bad thing to do to try some variations. And that's just good advice for anybody. So a couple things to remember. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, while most of these immigrants will be what are known as Palatines, not all of them will be. If your ancestor was not Pennsylvania Dutch, but maybe New Jersey German or Virginia German, you should still be checking these lists, because well over 2/3 of all Germans that immigrate to what will become the United States during colonial times will go through Philadelphia. They might spill out in different areas, but there is an excellent chance that they came through Philadelphia. So when in doubt, go ahead and check these lists. Caspar Schaefer that we talked about earlier, he doesn't set up in Pennsylvania. He sets up in New Jersey and becomes very successful there. But because I've got that, I can trace his journey. As we talked about, bear in mind the names can be brutally misspelled. Try phonetics and get creative. Also, once again, the fan method. Friends, associates, and neighbors. If you're having trouble finding a particular immigrant, take a look at their neighbors, their associates, etc. One of the really cool things about these lists, like let's say I'm looking at a B list with an oath of allegiance, they're taking everybody from that ship that came into port a day or two ago, and they're taking them to the Pennsylvania courthouse and having them swear the oath of allegiance one after the other. So if you are having a hard time tracking your immigrant, if you can find someone else on that list and track them back to their home village, you have an excellent chance of success of finding your ancestor in the old country. Finally, check all three lists, okay? As we talked about, there are differences between all three of them, particularly the A list, which can name both women and children. Every single list entry gives you an opportunity for more information that can confirm your particular ancestor and how they got to this country. Always check all three just to see. So let's just take a look at an example from all three lists. I am cheating a little bit here, but not too bad, because this man was relatively prominent. You'll see a painting of one Alexander Mack. He was the founder of the Brethren movement in Rationale. This was a relatively small Protestant group that became known as the, somewhat uncharitably, the Dunkers, because they believed that you needed to be baptized 3 times underwater during the baptismal ceremony. Unsurprisingly, this was also regarded as very radical at the time, and so he and his followers would flee to Philadelphia aboard the good ship Allen on September 11th, 1729, and they would end up setting up shop in what is today the Philadelphia suburb of Germantown. Taking a look here, if you look off to the left, List 10A, a list of passengers imported in the ship Allen from Rotterdam, Master James Craig, September 11th, 1729. One Alexander Mack is the very first one up here. And then, of course, if I come over to the B list over here, once again, I've got some further information about the ship's journey. I know that, for example, it landed at Cowes in the Isle of Wight from July 7th, etc. And once again, Alexander Mack, although spelled slightly different here, is at the very top of the list. This is his oath of allegiance to the British Crown. And then once again, the C list. I've got Alexander Mack at the very top for swearing any allegiance to the Pope or the Stuarts. And you can see, if you take a close look, some individuals will be listed on some lists and not the others. But because I have all three lists, I know that these people came together, I know how they're connected, and I have a real opportunity here to be able to do further research. So when in doubt, check all three lists. And once again, right now I have the facsimiles from the B list and the C list. So if I take a look here, Alexander Mack and Alexander Mack, it's a little bit different, but I also think that it's pretty clear that these signatures are by the same person. I think it's just so incredibly helpful to have this in front of you, particularly when you're looking at other documents that may have to do with your ancestors. Land records, for example, will often have to be signed. So much of colonial research is panning for gold, and this is just a really incredible tool to try to use for it. All right, so that's basically how the lists were generated and how you use them. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Kate for questions.
We do have a few questions for you. And the first one is, can you please point out where Alsace would be in relation to Germany and France?
So Alsace is roughly about halfway up the Rhine. It's the area that's roughly around Strasbourg and runs just north of Basel in Switzerland. Let me just go ahead and put that in the chat.
Thank you. Our next question is, where do you find the indenture records?
So many of those will be digitized on Family Search, as well as the Pennsylvania State Archives.
Someone asks, after the Revolution, were German immigrants who immigrated to the colonies before the war required to agree to the oaths?
It runs until 1808. So basically, how it works is so you won't really see much in the way of immigration for obvious reasons between 1776 and about 1783 or so because the revolution is going. But those that do will have to swear allegiance to the state of Pennsylvania. And then, of course, when the revolution breaks out all across the 13 colonies, people will be forced to take additional oaths of loyalty, usually to the new state governments as well.
Thank you. And someone is asking, where did you say that the Pennsylvania German Pioneers volumes are archived?
Well, I'm not so sure about archived. They've been published for decades now. On our handout, though, you'll have links to digital copies of all 3 volumes on Internet Archive. So that's probably what we meant there. And of course, we have the physical volumes here at the center as well.
Someone else is asking, is something similar to this available for other European countries?
If you're talking about colonial America, not really, because it's a very unique set of circumstances that generates these lists, primarily fear of the other. Obviously, the 13 colonies drew people from all over Europe on some level, but it's also overwhelmingly British and Northern Irish. And because of that fact, if you're going from, say, Sussex to Massachusetts, as far as the British Crown is concerned, at least initially, later on you'll see, like when you get to about 1775, people will start freaking out a bit and they'll start trying to put in lists and stuff. It's just moving from one end of the country to the other. They don't really care. And because you won't really see this mass influx of another set of foreigners with their strange German ways, you don't really see it for anything else. No other colony would tolerate this large amount of foreigners setting themselves up in said colony. It's a real testament to the unique nature of Pennsylvania and William Penn's vision.
Thank you. Somebody's asking where they can find more information about language and phonetics.
So there's some really excellent books that have come out, particularly if you're talking about German. There's a really good book that came out a few years ago. I think it was by Meinert. I think he's the really big guy when it comes to German American genealogy. But it really depends on what specifics we're looking for.
Someone's asking, did ships ever make multiple stops along the coast of the U.S. in the mid-1700s, or were they single destination?
So for these kinds of ships, it's pretty much single destination, right? I think it's important to remember that this particular setup is a very unique one, and really only goes for, you know, the lists run from roughly 1727 to the early 1800s, but when it comes to like large scale immigration, we're largely talking the 1740s to about the 1750s when it stops because the 7 Years' War breaks out. So these particular ships are focused pretty much exclusively on just going to a single port and then making their way back, because they're picking things up. You will sometimes see ships, making their way down, particularly if they're involved in trade to the Caribbean. But as far as these ships go, I have never seen any of them, like, after they drop a bunch of Germans off in Philadelphia, they're headed to Bermuda. So, generally speaking, we're looking at kind of it's like a triangle, but it's Holland, some port in England, Philadelphia, back.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. So our next one is, are the maps presented available for download anywhere?
Well, I actually had ChatGPT create the Rotterdam to Pennsylvania map, but some of the other ones are. Pretty much all the other ones are primarily, I got them on Wikimedia, which is a free counterpart to Wikipedia. And then some of them I got from the History of Pennsylvania German book that I put in the handout. So I don't believe that one is available for download, but if there is one or two specifically that you want, just send us an email and be happy to send them to you.
And did other passengers join the ships at port in England?
Very rarely. It did happen from time to time at places like Cowes or Bristol, but usually not. These tended to be pretty organized, uh, almost like caravans, basically. You won't see a lot of like, English people on the Isle of Wight get on board one of these ships. They tend to be pretty exclusively German when it comes to the passenger makeup. The reason that they're going to England in the first place is not because they want to, right? But because they legally have to. They have to pay, the taxes and get the paperwork sorted out before they can come to the New World, because it is strictly illegal to go straight from Rotterdam to Philadelphia. So because these ships are usually charted by the immigrants, or I should say charted by some sort of brokerage, basically. You'll find like a ship broker in Rotterdam that has connections in London. They're almost like renting the ship out like you would rent out a place for a party or something, right? So it's pretty unusual to see other people join. And of course, even if you did, they wouldn't be on the list because they're English. They don't have to swear a loyalty oath, and they're not a foreigner, so the captain isn't required to write them down.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll do one more question here today. And if anybody has any questions that we didn't get to, please send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info, and we can correspond with you there. Or if you'd like a copy of the chat, send us an email as well, and we'll get that to you. So for our last question, this person says, looking quickly at volume 3, the index, do you have to read through each page, or at what specific point in the volume are the surnames listed, like how you
Towards
showed?
towards the back.
Okie doke.
Yeah. If you're on Internet Archive, you can actually search the text for a particular name. Although or you can choose the page from like there's a little scrolly bar. So I usually recommend in this case using the scrolly bar to flip all the way to the back, because of course, like we saw with so many of these lists, the index is great because it also contains different spellings, right? So some people have been disappointed by just trying to search the text, only to find out that their ancestor's there, but they just goofed up the last name.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll finish us up for today. And again, email us at genealogy@acpl.info with any questions or for a copy of the chat. So thank you to Logan for presenting, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thanks for coming, folks.
Bye-bye.